I learned early that silence made life easier in my house. At dinner, I spoke last, if at all, because my words never mattered much. My father, Richard, always asked Daniel about money, bonuses, and plans. My mother, Linda, smiled wide and nodded like every sentence from him was gold. When they turned to me, it was different. They asked, "Still at that job?" I laughed and said, "Yeah, it pays the bills." Daniel grinned. I swallowed the rest of my thoughts and kept chewing. No one noticed, and the table felt colder each quiet night while I stayed invisible. Daniel loved the attention. He leaned back, confident, tapping his phone, letting praise wash over him. "Big month," he said. "Clients are lining up." My father clapped his shoulder. "That's my son." I forced a smile. "I fixed the sink today," I said, trying to sound useful. My mother waved her hand. "That's nice." Daniel laughed softly. "You should aim higher." I nodded like the joke did not hurt. Inside, something tight twisted, but I stayed quiet. Their voices filled the room, leaving no space for mine again. I learned to breathe shallow and wait. That became my role there. I worked hard, just quietly. My job paid little, but it was honest, steady in mine. I never asked my parents for money. I brought groceries, fixed doors, drove them to appointments. Actions matter, I told myself. But at dinner, action stayed invisible. Words about income ruled everything. Daniel talked numbers. My father leaned forward. My mother asked questions. I watched steam rise from my plate and counterbites. Every chew felt like proof I was failing some test I never agreed to take. No one graded effort, only results, and my score stayed low according to them every time. Sometimes I tried humor. "At least I don't bring work home," I joked once. Daniel smirked. "That's because you don't have real work." My father chuckled. My mother avoided my eyes. I felt heat crawl up my neck. I wanted to shout, to explain, to be seen. Instead, I lifted my glass and said cheers. Silence followed, thick and awkward. I drank fast. In my head, I asked why love felt like a competition I kept losing without rules. Nobody noticed my shaking hand or the way my smile hurt. That pain stayed after dinner ended. Each night alone afterward. Family gatherings repeated the pattern. Birthdays, holidays, random Sundays all felt the same. Daniel arrived late, praised loudly. I arrived early, helped quietly. "He's so driven," my parents said. "He's so ambitious." About me, they said, "He's comfortable." The word sounded like an insult. I was not comfortable. I was tired. I was bending myself smaller to fit their frame. Every compliment for Daniel pressed me flatter into the chair. I learned to disappear without leaving, breathing softly, smiling thin. That survival skill followed me everywhere, even home, including nights when I stared at ceilings wondering what I lacked inside. My brother was not cruel on purpose. That truth confused me. He never pushed me down directly. He just accepted being lifted above me. "You should try sales," he said once. "It's not for everyone," I replied. He shrugged. "Suit yourself." My parents nodded like the matter was settled. Their faith in him felt endless. Their patience with me felt limited. I stopped arguing. I stored every slight carefully, like coins, heavy and cold, filling my pockets slowly. I told myself weight meant value, that someday it would buy peace. But hope stayed thin, like paper folded too often already. One evening, my mother called before dinner. Her voice sounded serious. "We need everyone present tomorrow," she said. "It's important." My stomach dropped. Important meant decisions. Decisions never favored me. I asked, "Is everything okay?" She paused. "We'll talk then." The line went dead. I sat on my couch, phone in hand, heart racing. Part of me hoped this meeting would change things. A larger part already knew better, and that scared me more. I practiced answers, imagined courage, and failed both silently. The ceiling listened while I whispered doubts. Sleep never came easily that night. Before morning arrived eventually. The next day, dinner felt heavier than usual. Plates clinked. No one smiled. My father cleared his throat. "We've been thinking," he began. Daniel sat straight, confident. I sank back, bracing myself. My mother folded her hands. "This affects the family," she said. I nodded, already excluded. I watched their faces, searching for any sign of fairness. I found none. My chest tightened. Whatever they planned, I knew my role already. Listener, support, backup, never priority. The realization settled before words landed. I inhaled slowly, preparing for disappointment I recognized too well. This was familiar pain. I stayed quiet again. My father said, "We're calling a family meeting." The phrase echoed. Daniel glanced at me, unreadable. My mother added, "Big decisions need unity." I almost laughed. Unity never included me. I asked when. My voice sounded small. "Now," my father said. The room closed in. I felt 12 again, waiting for grades. I knew I would not be chosen. I did not know how deeply that truth would cut, but I felt the edge already. Something fragile cracked inside me, silent, final, and long overdue. I looked at my plate, not them. Hope drained away completely, without warning signs left. As they talked, I faded. Their voices blurred together. Plans formed without me included. I nodded when expected. I agreed when required. Inside, I was already leaving. I realized this meeting was not just about money. It was about worth, about choice. They were choosing Daniel, again. I felt calm, strangely. Hurt sat deep, but clarity rose above it. I would survive this. I always had. The quiet son learned endurance early. That night marked the beginning of something breaking and something else waking. I did not know the cost yet, only the direction forward away from them at last. I sat at the table while my father cleared his throat and said, "We've made a decision." My mother nodded and added, "It's about the savings." I asked, "What savings?" Daniel leaned back and smiled. My father said, "We're investing in Daniel's business." I blinked and said, "All of it?" My mother replied, "It's the smart move." I said, "What about my rent?" Silence followed. My father sighed and said, "You'll manage." My chest tightened. I whispered, "You promised to help me this year." No one answered. I looked at Daniel and said, "You knew about this?" He shrugged and said, "It's business." I asked, "So I lose my place?" My mother said, "Don't be dramatic." I said, "I'm not." My father added, "Daniel is a better investment." The words hit hard. I laughed once and said, "I'm your son." My mother replied, "Of course you are." Daniel said, "I'll help you later." I felt my face burn. "Later?" I repeated. He nodded. "When things settle." I stared at my hands. They shook slightly. I finally spoke louder. "I've never asked for much." My father said, "That's true." I continued, "I pay my own bills." My mother replied, "And we respect that." I said, "Then why does he get everything?" Daniel frowned. "I work hard." I said, "So do I." My father said, "Not like this." I asked, "Like what?" He gestured vaguely. "Ambition." I laughed bitterly. "So love has conditions." My mother said, "Don't twist our words." I said, "I'm hearing them clearly." My voice cracked, and I hated that it did. Daniel leaned forward. "You're taking this wrong." I asked, "What's the right way?" He said, "Be patient." I said, "I've been patient my whole life." My father said, "Enough." I stood slightly and said, "I just want fairness." My mother replied, "Life isn't fair." I said, "Family should be." Silence returned. Daniel avoided my eyes. My father said, "Sit down." I didn't. I said, "You made your choice." My mother whispered, "Please don't do this." I asked, "Do what?" She didn't answer. I sat back down, numb. My father explained numbers and timelines. I heard none of it. My head rang. Daniel nodded like this was normal. I asked, "So there's nothing for me?" My father said, "Not right now." I said, "I could lose my apartment." My mother said, "You'll figure it out." I repeated, "Figure it out." Daniel said, "I'll talk to you later." I snapped, "Stop saying that." He looked offended. "I'm trying to help." I replied, "You already won." My voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. The meeting ended without closure. My father stood and said, "This is final." My mother hugged Daniel. She didn't look at me. I grabbed my jacket. My mother asked, "You're leaving?" I said, "There's nothing for me here." My father said, "Don't be childish." I paused. "I'm being honest." Daniel said, "Call me tomorrow." I said, "No," that surprised him. I walked out without another word. The door closed behind me, and no one followed. I stood outside, breathing cold air, waiting for regret. None came. only relief mixed with pain. I drove home in silence. Every street felt unfamiliar. I replayed my father's words. Better investment. I said it out loud and laughed. The sound scared me. My apartment door creaked when I opened it. I dropped my keys and sat on the floor. I said, I'm disposable. The word echoed. I stood and paced. I remembered dinners, jokes, comparisons. Daniel's smile. My mother's excuses. My father's pride. I said I tried. No one answered. I checked my bank account and did the math. Fear rose, but anger burned hotter. Something shifted inside me quietly. I sat on my couch and stared at the wall. I asked myself, when did I become optional? I answered always. That hurt more than anything said earlier. I didn't cry. I waited for tears, but they never came. Instead, I fell hollow. I whispered, they chose. Saying it made it real. I picked up my phone, then put it down. There was no one to call. I thought about Daniel saying later. I said, later never comes. My chest felt tight, but calm. I realized this was the moment I stopped expecting rescue from people who never planned to save me. I lay on my bed, fully dressed. My thoughts raced. I argued with ghosts. You're selfish. I'm practical. You failed him. He failed himself. The voices sounded like my parents. I covered my ears and laughed again. The emptiness spread, steady and cold. I said, this is it. Not the end, but the truth. I saw my place clearly for the first time. I was not a priority. I was not an investment. I was excess. Understanding that hurt deeply, but it also freed something inside me. Expectations died quietly, and the silence felt final and heavy. Morning came without rest. I sat at the table alone and drank cheap coffee. I said, I'm on my own. The words felt solid. I thought about calling my parents, then stopped. There was nothing left to say. I thought about Daniel and felt tired instead of angry. I whispered, good luck. I looked around my small apartment and felt a strange affection. This place was mine for now. I didn't know how I would keep it, but I knew one thing. I would never beg them again. That decision settled deep. Something inside me cracked completely, and something else stood up. I stopped calling them the next day. I waited for my phone to ring. It didn't. I said out loud, so this is how easy it is. I went to work early and stayed late. My manager asked, you okay? I said fine. He nodded and moved on. That was easier. At lunch, I skipped eating and checked my budget. I said cut the gym. I said cancel streaming. I said sell the old guitar. No one argued. Silence agreed with everything. It felt cold but efficient, like a tool I finally learned to use. One evening, Marcus walked past my desk and said, you look dead. I replied, thanks. He laughed and pulled a chair. Seriously, man, what's going on? I shrugged. Family stuff. He said, that's always the worst stuff. I looked at him and said, they chose my brother. Marcus didn't interrupt. He waited. I added, they always do. He nodded slowly. That sucks. No advice. No fixing. Just that. I felt something loosen. I said, I'm trying to survive. He replied, then you're doing fine. We started eating lunch together. Marcus talked about work, stress, and bills. He said, money doesn't mean effort. I asked, then why does everyone act like it does? He smiled sadly. Because it's easy to measure. I told him about cutting expenses. He said, smart. I told him about my parents. He said, unfair. That was it. No excuses for them. No defense. I realized how rare that felt. Someone believing me without proof. I didn't have to explain my worth. I just existed, and that was enough in that moment. A week later, I met Evelyn through work. She shook my hand and said, you listen well. I said, I'm quiet. She smiled. That's different. We talked about the project. She asked questions others skipped. Why this process? What happens if it fails? I answered honestly. She nodded and said, you think before speaking. I laughed softly. I learned to. She paused. From where? I said home. She didn't push. She just said, that explains your patience. No pity, just observation. It felt respectful. I like that more than praise. Marcus noticed me staying later. He said, you're hiding. I replied, I'm working. He said, both can be true. I didn't argue. After work, he said, beer. I said, I can't afford it. He waved his hand. I can. I hesitated. He added, no debt. Just company. I agreed. Over cheap beer, he asked, you miss them? I said, I miss who I thought they were. He nodded. That hurts longer. I stared at the table and said, I won't call first again, saying it felt like a promise to myself. Online, my parents posted photos with Daniel. So proud. Big moves. Our boy. I scrolled past quickly. Then I scrolled back. I said, it doesn't hurt. My chest disagreed. I showed Marcus. He said, mute them. I asked, isn't that petty? He shrugged. Is bleeding noble? I muted them. The silence felt heavy at first, then lighter, like removing noise I never needed. I realized I didn't owe them front row access to my pain. That thought stayed with me. It felt new, protective, necessary. Evelyn called me after a meeting. You handled that conflict well, she said. I replied, I didn't say much. She said, exactly. I laughed. Silence again. She said, silence can be strength. I paused. No one had said that to me before. I asked, you really think so? She said, I know so. Her certainty unsettled me. After the call, I sat still. I asked myself, when did silence stop being survival and start being choice? I didn't know the answer yet, but I liked the question. Marcus noticed the change. He said, you stand straighter. I replied, do I? He said, yeah. I shrugged. I stopped apologizing. He raised his glass. About time. We talked about dreams we never said out loud before. I admitted, I don't know what I want. He said, that's honest. I said, I only know what I don't want. He said, that's a start. I felt lighter walking home. The streetlights looked the same, but I felt different under them, like I belonged to myself again. One night, my mother finally texted, everything okay? I stared at the screen. I typed yes, then deleted it. I typed nothing and put the phone down. My hand shook. I said, I don't have to explain anymore. The phone stayed silent after that. Days passed. Nothing. I realized they didn't notice my absence. That hurt, but it also clarified everything. I wasn't punishing them. I was protecting myself. That difference mattered. It kept me steady when guilt tried to sneak in late at night. At work, Evelyn asked, do you ever doubt yourself? I laughed. Constantly. She said, why? I answered, because I was taught to. She nodded. Then unlearn it. Simple words. Hard work. I said, I don't know how. She replied, start by not shrinking. I thought of family dinners. I said, I'm tired of shrinking. She smiled. Good. That single word felt like permission. Not from her, but from me. I walked back to my desk feeling taller. I checked my budget again and said, I can survive this month. That felt like victory. I told Marcus. He said, proud of you. The word hit harder than expected. I joked, don't tell my parents. He smiled. They don't need to know. I realized then that love didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it sat beside you quietly, shared cheap beer, and listened. I didn't need to beg for that. I just needed to accept it. That night, I lay in bed and replayed old conversations. Then I stopped. I said enough. I focused on tomorrow's work, on Marcus's laugh, on Evelyn's calm voice. I chose silence again, but this time it felt deliberate. Not fear, not weakness, strategy, survival. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was conserving energy for a life that didn't require permission. For the first time, I didn't reach out for approval. I stayed still, and the quiet held me instead of hurting me. Evelyn called me into a quiet meeting room and said, I'm starting something new. I asked, what kind of something? She replied, a small operation. Legal. Complicated. Risky. I stayed quiet. She continued, I need someone steady. I said, that doesn't sound like me. She smiled. It sounds exactly like you. I laughed once. I don't have experience. She said, you have judgment. I asked, what's the pay? She answered honestly, less at first. My chest tightened. She added, more later. I didn't answer right away. I walked out and found Marcus by the vending machine. He said, you look like you saw a ghost. I said, Evelyn offered me a role. He asked, good one? I shrugged. Risky. He grinned. Everything worth doing is. I said, it pays less. He frowned. For now. I nodded. He said, then what's the problem? I admitted, I'm scared. He leaned closer. Of what? I said, failing again. He shook his head. You already survived worse. I stared at the floor. He added, say yes. I went home and paced. I said out loud, I can't afford mistakes. Then I said, I can't afford staying still. My phone buzzed. It was Marcus. Did you decide? I said, not yet. He replied, you won't grow where you're safe. I hung up and sat down. I thought about my parents calling only when they needed something. I thought about Evelyn trusting me without asking for proof. I whispered, I choose the risk. The next morning, I told Evelyn, I'll do it. She nodded once. Good. My hand shook, but I felt awake. Our first meeting was tense. She said, speak if you disagree. I said, I usually don't. She replied, start now. I hesitated. She waited. I said, your timeline is tight. She smiled. What? I explained my concern. She listened. Then she said, that's useful. The word surprised me. Useful. I wasn't invisible. After the meeting, she said, you think ahead. I said, I overthink. She corrected me. You prepare. That felt different. I wrote it down later so I wouldn't forget. The work was hard. I stayed late. I asked questions. I made mistakes and fixed them. Evelyn didn't rescue me. She asked, what do you think? I answered instead of deflecting. My voice sounded stronger each time. Marcus noticed. He said, you're glowing. I laughed. I'm tired. He said, good tired. One night, he asked, regrets? I said, no, that surprised me. I'm in it. Fear still lived in me, but it wasn't driving anymore. I was learning to steer. Halfway through the week, my mother called. I stared at the phone. I answered. She said, we need a favor. I didn't greet her. She continued, Daniel needs help. I asked, what kind? She said, connections. I laughed quietly. You never called to ask how I am. She said, this is important. I replied, so am I. Silence stretched. My father took the phone. Don't be difficult. I said, I'm busy. He said, with what? I answered, my life. My heart raced, but I didn't back down. My father said, family comes first. I replied, not for me. My mother said, we raised you. I said, and I raised myself after. Daniel's voice cut in. Just tell me this once. I closed my eyes. I said, no, the word landed heavy. No explanation. No apology. Just no. Silence followed. Then my mother said, I don't recognize you. I answered, I finally do. The line went dead. I stood there shaking but smiling. Power hummed through the quiet. At work the next day, Evelyn noticed. You look lighter, she said. I replied, I said no. She nodded. That's hard. I said, it felt right. She said, remember that feeling. We reviewed plans. She challenged my ideas. I challenged hers. She didn't shut me down. She asked why. I explained. She adjusted. Trust grew in real time. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was contributing. I felt useful again, but deeper. I felt chosen by myself. That mattered more than approval. Marcus called that night. Did you help them? I said no. He paused. Then he laughed. Proud of you. I leaned against the wall. It was scary. He replied, courage usually is. I told him about the project. He said, you sound alive. I smiled. I feel alive. He said, then keep choosing that. I promised I would. After the call, I sat quietly. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. I checked my bank account and frowned. Less money. More risk. I shrugged. Worth it. I thought about my parents' silence. It didn't crush me. It confirmed my choice. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't reacting to disappointment. I was deciding direction. I said, this is my turning point. Saying it out loud made it real. I lay in bed and felt tired, nervous, hopeful. All at once. I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, knowing I had chosen myself without regret. Months passed without announcements. No celebrations. No applause. One morning, Marcus said, you're different. I asked how. He replied, calmer. I shrugged. I'm just working. He smiled. Exactly. At meetings, people listened when I spoke. No one clapped. They nodded and took notes. That felt better. Evelyn said, your judgment saved us time. I replied, I just followed the numbers. She said, that's skill. I didn't argue. I wrote it down later. Respect landed quietly, like snow, steady and real. I moved into a smaller place near work. Marcus helped me carry boxes. He joked, downgrade. I said, upgrade. He laughed. Fair. The apartment was quiet. No echoes of disappointment. I slept through the night for the first time in years. When I woke up, I said, this is enough. No one disagreed. I brewed cheap coffee and watched sunlight hit the wall. Peace didn't feel dramatic. It felt earned. I stopped checking my phone every hour. Silence stayed friendly. At work, Evelyn asked, do you want more responsibility? I said, yes. She nodded. Good. No speeches. Just trust. She corrected me when I was wrong. She listened when I was right. One afternoon, she said, you don't chase praise. I replied, I got tired. She said, that's why people trust you. I didn't know how to respond. I just worked harder. Growth came without noise. I learned systems, negotiations, timing. Skills stacked quietly. Marcus became routine. We ate together. We argued about movies. He said, you look healthier. I said, I stopped proving things. He raised his glass. To that, I told him about saving a little money. He said, proud of you. The word still startled me. I realized family didn't need blood. It needed presence. Marcus showed up without keeping score. That mattered more than history. Online, Daniel posted less. When he did, the tone changed. Tough month. Learning lessons. My parent commented, stay strong. Bad luck happens. I watched without reacting. One night, my mother texted, can you talk? I replied, busy. That was true. I was busy living. She didn't answer back. I didn't feel guilty. I felt clear. Evelyn noticed my focus. She said, you've stopped doubting every move. I replied, I still doubt. She said, but you act anyway. I smiled. I learned that. She asked, from who? I said, from being ignored. She paused. Use it wisely. I nodded. Pain had taught me discipline. I wasn't wasting it anymore. Marcus called one evening. Your brother's business is struggling. I said, I figured. He asked, does it bother you? I thought before answering. No, I said, it explains things. He said, you okay? I replied, I'm steady. And I was. I didn't feel joy at Daniel's trouble. I felt distance. That felt healthier. My father finally called. Daniel needs patience, he said. I replied, so do I. He said, this isn't about you. I answered, it never was. Silence followed. He hung up. I didn't shake afterward. I made dinner and ate slowly. Strength didn't announce itself. It showed up in moments like that, calm and unmoved. At work, a junior asked me, how do you stay composed? I said, I listen. He nodded. I realized people were watching me now. Quiet leadership surprised me. I didn't chase it. It found me anyway. One night, Marcus said, you don't seem angry anymore. I replied, I used it up. He smiled. Good. I looked around my small apartment and said, I'm okay. For the first time, it wasn't a lie. I wasn't rich. I wasn't praised. I was strong. Success didn't shout. It whispered, and I finally heard it. Daniel's business failed loudly. Marcus said, it's everywhere. I replied, I know. He showed me headlines. I said, I'm not surprised. He asked, how do you feel? I answered, quiet. That night, my doorbell rang. I opened it and saw my parents standing close together. My mother said, hello. My father added, we were nearby. I stepped aside and said, come in. They looked around like strangers. My mother said, you moved? I replied, yes. My father nodded. It's modest. I said, it's enough. My mother clasped her hands. Daniel is struggling, she said. I replied, I heard. My father cleared his throat. Investors pulled out. I said, that happens. My mother leaned forward. He needs help. I asked, what kind? She said, financial. The room felt still. My father added, just temporarily. I breathed slowly. I said, I can't. My mother blinked. You can. I shook my head. I won't. My father frowned. You're his brother. I answered, I'm also myself. My mother's voice softened. We wouldn't ask if it wasn't serious. I said, you only ask when it's serious for him. My father said, that's unfair. I replied, So was choosing him every time. Silence fell. My mother said, "We made mistakes." I asked, "When did you notice?" She didn't answer. My father said, "This isn't about the past." I said, "It always is." My hand stayed steady. That surprised me. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't shouting. I was present. My mother whispered, "He could lose everything." I said, "So could I." My father said, "You landed on your feet." I replied, "Because I had no choice." My mother said, "Family helps family." I answered, "Family doesn't rank children." Her eyes filled. I didn't feel cruel. I felt clear. My father said, "You're holding a grudge." I shook my head. "I'm holding boundaries." The word felt right. It stayed. My father sighed. "You've changed." I said I had to. My mother asked, "Do you hate us?" I replied, "No, that surprised all of us." I added, "I just won't disappear anymore." My father said, "Daniel is scared." I said, "So was I." Silence returned. My mother looked down. My father stood. "We hoped you'd understand." I said, "I do." He paused. "Then why refuse?" I answered, "Because understanding doesn't require sacrifice." They moved toward the door. My mother turned back. "If things were different," I said, "they aren't." She nodded slowly. My father opened the door and said, "We'll manage." I replied, "I hope you do." They left quietly. No shouting. No insults. Just disappointment. I closed the door and leaned against it. My heart raced, then slowed. I said, "I chose myself," saying it felt heavy and right. That night, Marcus called. "They came to you, didn't they?" I said, "Yes." He asked, "What did you do?" I answered. I said no. He paused. "You okay?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "That's honest." I laughed softly. "I feel relieved," he replied, "and guilty." I said, "Yes." He said, "Both can exist." I thanked him. He said, "You're not wrong." I needed to hear that. I sat alone and replayed the conversation. My mother's eyes. My father's tone. I asked myself, was I cruel? I answered, no. I asked, was I free? I answered, not yet. Guilt pressed on my chest. Relief pushed back. They fought quietly. I said, I didn't wish them harm. That mattered. I hadn't enjoyed saying no. I had respected it. That felt new. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother read, "We're disappointed." I typed, "I understand," then deleted it. I typed nothing. Silence felt like armor. I made tea and sat down. I said, walking away isn't punishment. The room listened. I said, it's protection. My breathing slowed. The guilt softened. Not gone. Softer. I thought about Daniel. I hoped he learned. I hope he survived. I didn't plan to save him. That truth hurt, but it didn't break me. I said, I'm allowed to choose. The words settled deep. Karma hadn't knocked loudly. It whispered. It asked who I valued. For the first time, my answer didn't betray me. Daniel called at night. I stared at the screen and said, of course. I answered. He said, hey. I replied, hey. Silence stretched. He sighed and said, I didn't know who else to call. I said, you found me. He laughed weakly. Yeah. I waited. He finally said, I'm tired. I replied, of what? He said, of pretending I'm fine. His voice cracked. That caught me off guard. He said, everything is falling apart. I answered, I know. He asked, did they come to you? I said, yes. He went quiet. Then he said, I'm sorry about that. I asked about what? He replied, about how things always went. I didn't interrupt. He continued, they put everything on me. I said, they always did. He whispered, I felt like I couldn't fail. I closed my eyes. You could, I said. You just weren't allowed to. Daniel laughed without humor. You make it sound simple. I said, it isn't. He said, I envied you. That surprised me. I asked why. He said, you could walk away. I replied, I didn't feel free. He said, but you were. I thought about that. I said, maybe. He cleared his throat. I should have defended you. I stayed silent. He added, I didn't. I said, I noticed. He exhaled sharply. I'm sorry. The apology landed heavy. I said, that hurts. He said, I know. I asked why now. He answered, because I'm scared. I nodded. That makes sense. He said, I don't need money. I raised an eyebrow. Then why call? He hesitated. I need help. I said, what kind? He said, advice. I relaxed slightly. I can do that. He sounded relieved. Really? I replied, yes. He asked, what would you do? I said, start smaller. He laughed bitterly. I don't know how. I said, learn. He said, everyone expects more. I replied, everyone doesn't live your life. He went quiet again. Then he said, they'll be disappointed. I answered, they already are. He sighed. You're colder now. I said, I'm clearer. They made a pause. Daniel said, do you hate me? I replied, no. He asked, then why won't you help more? I said, because helping isn't rescuing. He frowned. What's the difference? I said, one teaches, one traps. He was silent. I added, you were trapped. He said, so were you. I nodded. Yes. That felt like truth. Shared truth. Equal ground. He asked, if you had money, would you give it to me? I answered honestly. No. He sucked in a breath. Why? I said, because it wouldn't fix what broke. He snapped. Easy for you to say. I replied, it wasn't easy to learn. Silence again. He said, I thought family meant saving each other. I said, family also means not repeating damage. Daniel's voice dropped. I don't know who I am without success. I said, neither did I. He asked, how did you figure it out? I replied, I failed quietly. He laughed. I'm failing loudly. I said, failure isn't the volume. He said, then what is it? I answered, refusing to learn. He didn't argue. That mattered. He said, they keep calling. I replied, you don't have to answer. He scoffed. They sacrificed for me. I said, so did I. He went still. I never saw that. I replied, I know. He whispered, I wish I had. I said, me too. The sadness between us felt shared now. Not competitive. Just heavy. Daniel said, if I walk away, they'll blame you. I answered, they already do. He sighed. You're stronger than me. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see it. No, I said, I just stopped performing. He asked, can you teach me that? I paused. I can tell you what helped. He said, tell me. I said, stop chasing their approval. He laughed softly. That sounds impossible. I replied, so did breathing once. He grew quiet. Then he said, I don't deserve your patience. I answered, I'm not giving patience. He asked, then what? I said, clarity. He mulled that over. You won't save me, he said. I replied, no. He said, but you won't abandon me either. I considered it. I won't lie to you, I said. He exhaled. That's something. Daniel's voice tightened. They expect miracles. I said, you're human. He laughed sharply. They forget that. I replied, so did you. Silence settled. Then he said, I'm angry at you. I asked why. He said, because you got out. I answered, you can too. He snapped, not without falling. I said, falling isn't death. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm tired. I replied, rest. He said, they won't let me. I answered, they don't control your sleep. He scoffed. You make it sound easy. I said, I make it sound possible. He sighed. That's worse. I smiled sadly. Possibility scares people. Daniel finally said, I need money. I closed my eyes. I won't give it. He groaned. I knew it. I said, but I'll help you plan. He said, that won't fix things now. I replied, neither will money. He cursed under his breath. You've changed. I answered, so have you. He snapped. I didn't ask for this lesson. I said, neither did I. His breathing grew fast. I thought you'd understand. I replied, I do. He said, then prove it. I said, understanding doesn't mean agreement. He went silent. Then he said, you're choosing yourself again. I answered, yes. He laughed bitterly. Must be nice. I replied, it was expensive. Daniel exhaled hard. I don't know what to do. I said, start by telling the truth. He asked, to who? I answered, to yourself. He scoffed. That's it. I said, that's the start. He was quiet. Then he said, they'll hate me. I replied, they might. He whispered, will you? I said, no. The call stretched thin. Daniel finally said, I need time. I replied, take it. He said, you're not coming to save me. I answered, no. He sighed. I thought so. His voice carried frustration, not hatred. That mattered. He said goodbye. I replied, good luck. The line went dead. I sat with the silence. My chest hurt, but it didn't collapse. I felt sad but steady. I understood him now. That didn't mean I would bleed for him. Understanding wasn't forgiveness. It was clarity. I leaned back and said, I didn't betray myself. The room stayed quiet. That quiet felt earned. The news didn't come from me. Marcus said, people are talking. I asked about what. He grinned. Your project. I shrugged. It worked. He laughed. That's an understatement. At work, Evelyn said, congratulations. I asked, on what? She replied, leadership. I blinked. Me? She nodded. You earned it. I said, I didn't ask. She smiled. That's why you get it. The raise followed quietly. No ceremony. Just numbers on paper. Stability felt strange. Solid. Marcus slapped my shoulder. Drinks are on you now. I said, cheap ones. He laughed. Deal. I checked my account that night and exhaled. I said, I'm safe. The word mattered. I slept without calculating rent. In the morning, I walked to work slowly. I wasn't rushing anymore. I was arriving. My phone buzzed. A message from my mother read, we heard about your promotion. I stared at it. I didn't reply. An hour later, my father texted, proud of you. The words felt late. Not wrong. Just late. Marcus noticed my silence. They found out. I nodded. He said, how do you feel? I answered, steady. That surprised me. Evelyn called me in her office. You handled pressure well, she said. I replied, I learned how. She asked, from where? I said, from being overlooked. She nodded, turned into strength. I smiled. I had help. She said, you used it. That felt fair. My mother called that evening. I answered. She said, we're so proud. I said, thank you. She added, we always believed in you. I didn't argue. I let the words sit. My father said, we should celebrate. I replied, coffee is fine. There was a pause. Just coffee? My mother asked. I said, just coffee. We met at a quiet cafe. They arrived early. My mother stood to hug me. I allowed it. My father said, you look well. I replied, I am. We sat. Silence filled the table. My mother finally said, we worried about you. I nodded. My father added, you never called. I said, neither did you. I kept my voice calm. My mother said, we didn't know how. I replied, you never asked. She opened her mouth, then closed it. My father said, we made mistakes. I said, yes. He waited. I didn't add more. The quiet grew heavy. My mother said, Daniel is rebuilding. I nodded. I hope he does well. That was true. My father leaned forward. We want to be closer. I asked how. He hesitated. My mother said, like before. I replied, there was no before. Silence again. I stir my coffee. I didn't defend myself. I didn't accuse them. I let space speak. My mother's voice softened. We're proud now. I looked at her. I didn't need pride, I said. I needed fairness. She flinched. My father said, we didn't realize. I answered, I know. That seemed to hurt more than anger. My mother asked, can we start again? I took a breath. Slowly, I said, with boundaries. My father nodded. Of course. I didn't promise more. I paid for my coffee and stood. My mother said, already? I replied, I have work. That was true. Outside, Marcus texted, how'd it go? I typed quiet. He replied, good or bad? I answered different. He sent a thumbs up. At work, a junior asked, how do you lead without raising your voice? I said, I listen. He nodded like that mattered. I realized my parents' approval didn't. Not anymore. That night, my mother texted, thank you for meeting us. I replied, you're welcome. Nothing more. I didn't feel guilty. I felt complete. I sat in my apartment and said, I didn't win. I paused. I changed. Power hadn't arrived with noise. It settled quietly. No revenge. No speeches. Just distance, earned and respected. I had my life back, and no one could take it without my permission. Daniel told me he was leaving through a short call. He said, I'm moving. I asked where. He replied, another city. I said, for work? He paused. For space. I nodded. That makes sense. He added, I need to start over. I said, I hope it helps. He hesitated. I wanted you to know. I replied, thank you for telling me. He sighed. This feels like running. I said, sometimes it's breathing. He was quiet. Take care, he said. You too, I replied. After that call, the house felt quieter even though I lived alone. Marcus noticed it. He said, you look tired. I replied, a different kind. He asked, sad. I thought and said, grieving. He frowned. Over him. I shook my head. Over what never happened. He nodded slowly. That's heavy. I said, it is. He didn't rush me. He just sat there. That helped more than words. My parents stopped calling as much. When they did, their voices sounded older. My mother said, Daniel settled in. I replied, good. She said, the house is quiet now. I answered, I know the feeling. Silence followed. My father cleared his throat. We miss you. I said, I know. That was all. No fixing. No promises. The distance stayed. It felt permanent, not cruel. At work, Evelyn noticed my mood. She asked, what are you carrying? I replied, old weight. She said, does it belong to you? I shrugged. It's been with me so long. She leaned back. You don't forgive to erase history. I listened. She continued. You forgive to set yourself down. I asked, what if I'm not ready? She said, then write. I laughed softly. Write what? She smiled. The truth. That night, I sat at my table with paper. I stared at it and said, I don't know where to start. I wrote my parents' names. I wrote Daniel's. My hand shook. I said out loud, you hurt me. Writing it felt sharp. I wrote, you chose sides. I wrote, I felt invisible. I stopped and breathed. I didn't accuse. I described. I wrote what I lost. I wrote what I wished for. The words came slow and heavy. I read the letter aloud to the empty room. I wanted fairness. My voice cracked. I wanted to be enough. I kept going. I forgive you, not because you earned it, but because I'm tired. Saying that hurt and helped. I folded the paper. I didn't address it. I didn't seal it. I placed it in a drawer. The act felt final. Not dramatic. Just done. Marcus called. You sound quiet, he said. I replied, I wrote something. He asked, did it help? I said, it weighed a lot. He laughed softly. That means it mattered. I said, I'm not angry anymore. He replied, that's big. I corrected him. It's slow. He said slow lasts. Evelyn checked in the next day. Did you write? She asked. I said, yes. She asked, did you send it? I answered, no, she nodded. Good. I smiled. It was for me. She said, exactly. We sat in silence for a moment. It wasn't awkward. It was calm. I thought about Daniel starting over. I hope he learned to rest. I hoped he learned who he was without applause. I didn't plan to follow. My path felt steady. I said to myself, I don't need closure from them. That surprised me. The closure lived inside now. My mother texted one evening, we're proud of you. I read it twice. I replied, I hope you're well. Nothing more. The grief rose, then settled. I wasn't waiting anymore. I sat alone and said, healing isn't loud. The room agreed. I said, it's choosing not to reopen wounds. I felt tired but lighter. I hadn't forgiven to forget. I forgave to move forward. The weight didn't vanish. It shifted. I could carry it now without bending. That was enough. I woke up slowly and stretched. Marcus called. Morning, he said. I replied, morning. He asked, feeling okay? I said, better than I expected. He laughed. Big statement. I said, I mean it. I looked around my small apartment and said, this is mine. He asked, are you proud? I paused. I think so. He said, finally seeing it? I nodded. Yes. At work, Evelyn greeted me. You're calm today. I replied, it's been a long journey. She smiled. You earned it. I said, I didn't need permission to claim it. She laughed softly. Good answer. I walked to my desk, opened my notebook, and wrote tasks without hesitation. I spoke confidently in meetings. I asked questions. I disagreed politely. People listened. I felt steady. Marcus leaned against my desk later. You've changed. I said, I've grown. He asked, was it hard? I replied, every step. He said, worth it? I smiled. Absolutely. He shook his head. I mean, emotionally. I said, even more. We laughed lightly. I realized laughter was easier now, not forced. Not a shield. Real. I thought about my parents. I texted them once. Hope you're well. No reply. I didn't wait. I said out loud, I forgive you. Not for you, for me. The words felt heavy true. No expectation followed. No door opened. The peace that came surprised me. I wasn't ignored. I was choosing freedom. Daniel called briefly. New city is fine. I said good. He asked, do you hate me? I replied, no. He said, you sound different. I answered, I am. He paused. I should figure myself out. I said, you will. That felt like honesty, not pity. At lunch, Marcus asked, ever regret your choices? I said, sometimes. He leaned in. Do you feel smaller? I shook my head. Never smaller. Just quieter. He nodded. That counts. I smiled. It counts more than they thought. Evelyn stopped by my desk. You're handling everything well. I said, because I learned to trust myself. She asked, no more doubt. I replied, some doubt remains, but it doesn't drive me. She nodded. That's wisdom. I realized for the first time that I could measure success without applause. In the evening, I walked home slowly. Streetlights flickered. I said aloud, I was never less. Marcus texted, standing tall. I typed back, finally. I unlocked my apartment and sat on the window ledge. I watched city lights. Quiet. Steady. Mine. I thought about the years I had spent seeking approval. I said, I wanted to be seen, loved, chosen. Then I paused. I see myself now. My reflection in the window looked back calm, deliberate, whole. I whispered, I was enough all along. I brewed coffee and sat in silence. The quiet didn't hurt. It didn't isolate. It felt like home. I said, I build a life without applause. That realization carried weight. Not triumphal. Not loud. Just steady and solid. I recalled every meeting, every conversation with Evelyn. Every night Marcus sat beside me. I said I wasn't weak. I was quiet, learning strength. Each memory confirmed it. I wasn't less. I wasn't invisible. I had grown under the radar. At night, I opened my window and breathed deeply. The air felt clear. I said, I forgive them without needing them back. I didn't feel anger, just acceptance. The past settled in its place. My life stretched ahead, peaceful, unclaimed by old shadows. I turned toward my small living room, feeling the solidity of my choices. I said, I am enough. Not rich, not lauded, not chosen. Free. The words repeated softly. I felt them in my chest, steady. I whispered again, I was never less. I sat back, closed my eyes, and let the quiet fill me. No one applauded. No one noticed. I didn't need it. I said, this life is mine. A small smile appeared. A weight lifted. I was whole. I was free. I was enough.